Now we're going to have a discussion about 9th, 11th, and 13th chords. These are chords that have been around even as far back as the Baroque period, but really started to be a part of the common vocabulary of music in the Impressionistic period with composers like Debussy and Ravel in the late 19th century. Once we got to jazz, especially sort of hybrid composers like George Gershwin and true jazz composers like Duke Ellington, 9th, 11th, and 13th chords became an important part of the entire harmonic sound and vocabulary of this type of music. When we get into the bebop period in the 40s, and especially getting into the hard bop period and the more contemporary post-bop period in the 60s, 9th, 11th, and 13th chords became the important part of the harmonic framework. So it's important to know how to build these 9th, 11th, and 13th chords and what they are and why they are, and eventually what kinds of scales and melodic resources we have for improvising on these types of chords. So the first thing is to understand exactly what a 9th, 11th, and a 13th is. As everything else, if you know your major scales, you're in pretty good shape because you can find all your 9th, 11th, and 13ths directly from your major scale. Let's go to that C major scale again, and we'll build it up past the octave. Okay, so here we have 14 notes of a major scale. Okay, and we're pretty familiar already with the 7th chords. If you're trying to build a C7th of some kind, those notes have to be C, E, G, and some kind of B. That's our 1, 3, 5, and 7. So you can see if we just continue going on into the next octave, we're going to get our 9th, 11th, and 13th. The 9th of a C chord is going to be a D, and the 11th is going to be some kind of F, and the 13th is going to be some kind of C. Here they are right here. D is the 9th, F is the 11th, and A is the 13th. We're never going to see a 10th chord, a C10th. C10th would be the same thing as the 3rd, and we're never going to see a 12th chord. C12th would be right there. We already have a G in the first octave, and we're never going to see a 14th because, as you can see, the B is already present down here in the first octave with the 7th. So that's why we pretty much see odd numbers with chords, especially beyond the 9th. Every once in a while we might see a 6th chord or a 4 chord or a 2 chord. We can talk more about that later. But for right now, as long as you understand that basically the 9th, 11th, and 13th are the equivalent of the 2, 4, and 6. So let's go ahead and start building some of these. Remember, 9, 11, and 13 are the equivalent of 2, 4, and 6. Now I say the equivalent because they aren't the same thing. A 9th chord assumes that the 1, 3, 5, and 7 are somehow present in the harmonic sound. An 11th assumes that the 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 are in there, whereas a 4th chord does not. A 4th chord assumes only that a small portion of that is in there. Same thing with a 6th. A 6th assumes that there's a 1, 3, 5, and a 6 in there, whereas a 13th assumes that there's far more notes in there, the 1, the 3, the 5, the 7, the 9, and so on. So let's go ahead and just try to figure out what the 9th, 11th, and 13th are from a few different pitches. From C, we've already determined that 9, 11, and 13 are right here, D, F, and A. How about doing it from F? Well, if you know the F major scale, you know that the 2nd note is a G, and that would be our 9th. The 4th note is actually a B flat, and that would be our 11th. And the 6th note, I'm squeezing it up here, would be a D, and that would be our 13th. How about building it from A flat? Let's find out what the 9th, 11th, and 13th note of some A flat chord are going to be. Well, if you know the 2nd note of the A flat major scale, you'll know that the 9th is going to be a B flat. And the 11th, or the 4th note of the A flat major scale, is D flat. So an A flat 11 is going to have a D flat in it. And the 13th note, or the 6th note of the A flat major scale, is F. Let's build one more. How about from D? From D, the 9th note, or 2nd note of the D major scale, is E. And the 4th note, or 11th note of the D major scale, is G. And the 6th, or 13th note of the D major scale is B. So that's how you're going to basically find your 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths. It's important to know how to find those notes, and then we can build the chords after that. here's the good thing about 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths in different qualities. The 9th, 11th, and 13th note of a chord come from the major scale regardless of the quality of the chord. So, if I'm trying to build a C 11th chord, the 9th and the 11th are going to come from the major scale of C, even though the quality of this chord is dominant. Remember how we talked about that? Letter followed by an odd number with nothing in between, no M's or triangles or circles or null set signs or anything, is a dominant chord. So even though the scale for this is Mixolydian, the 9th and 11th come from the major scale of the root. The major scale of C has a D and an F in it. So if I'm trying to build a C11, I would build my C7th chord first, and then I would put my 2nd and 4th note of the C major scale as the 9th and the 11th. Let's try a different one. How about if we're trying to build an F13? All right, F13. Well, this, and once again, is a dominant chord. So if I'm going to build an F13, I'm going to build an F dominant chord, and then I'm going to put the 2nd, 4th, and 6th note of the F major scale in there, G, B flat, and D. That would give us our F13. How about from D? Let's say I want a D minor 13. Probably not a chord you're going to see too much, but we'll go ahead and build it anyway. First of all, it asks for you to build a minor 7th chord. So we're going to build our D minor 7th, D, F, A, and C. And then we're going to put the 2nd, 4th, and 6th note of the D major scale on top. 2nd note of the D major scale is E. The 4th note of the D major scale is G, and the 6th note of the D major scale is B. So there's our D minor 13. Kind of an interesting sound. Even going as far as to half diminished chords, let's build an E half diminished 11. E half diminished 11. Well, you got to know how to build the 7th first. So an E half diminished chord. Here's our E minor 7th, and remember to build a half diminished chord, you lower the 5th. So we're going to take that B and make it a flat. But our 11th comes from the major scale of E. So the 2nd and 4th note of the E major scale would be F sharp and A. So there's our E half diminished 11th chord. Yeah, that's a nice sound. E half diminished. Even for diminished chords, same thing. If we were to build a diminished chord, let's go ahead and erase that last one so I can give myself some room here. Let's say I'm trying to build a D sharp diminished 11th. Well, this one isn't easy. D sharp diminished chord, diminished 7th chord. Let's see, how did we do that? Well, it was all minor thirds, right? So if we go, we know it has to be spelled like this. All 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths have to be spelled like that. Space, 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 or line, 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 line. So if we go a step and a half from D sharp, we get F sharp. Step and a half from F sharp, we get A. Okay. Step and a half from A, we get C. And now at this point, we go to the 2nd and the 4th note of the D sharp major scale. Well, that's hard. There is no D sharp major scale. But there is a D major scale, and can you think that if we were to take the 2nd and 4th of a D major scale and raise them by a half step, we'd end up getting the 2nd and 4th note of a D sharp major scale, which is only theoretical. Right, so what's the 2nd and 4th note of the D major scale? Looks like the 2nd and 4th note are E and G, just like that. So if we raise those two pitches by a half step, we will get the 2nd and 4th note of a D sharp major scale. So that's why the 9th and 11th of a D sharp diminished chord are going to be E sharp and G sharp. And here's what that chord sounds like. No, sorry, here we go. Actually, sounds like a funny sound to begin with. But actually could be very practical. Okay, D sharp diminished. All right, so that's the idea of finding the 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths of these different qualities of chords. Regardless of the quality of the chord, 9, 11, and 13 come from the major scale of the root. All right, so now let's go on to some specific things about ninths, 11ths, and 13ths. A ninth chord assumes that the 1, 3, 5, and 7, and 9 are in the chord. So there's a C major ninth. An 11th chord also assumes that 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 are in there. So a C minor 11th chord is going to have a C minor 7th, and then we're going to have the 9th and the 11th in there. But a C 13th chord, or a 13th chord, let's go ahead and build that, C dominant 13. A 13th chord does not assume that the 11th is in the chord. It does assume that 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 are in there, but the 11th is not assumed unless it's asked for. So if I were to see a C 13th chord, I'd actually build it C, E, G, B flat. That's our dominant 7th chord. Remember, this is letter followed by number, so that's a dominant type. And then we're going to include the 9th, which is right there, but we don't include the 11th if it's asked for, unless it's asked for. So we're going to go straight up to the 13th, which is the 6th note of the C major scale, which is A. So here's my C13. Part of the reason for this is quite frequently with 11th chords, that 4th scale degree clashes with the 3rd scale degree. You can see that in this case, if we were to include the 4th scale degree in there, that F, it would have quite a clashing effect with the 3rd, which is down there lower in the octave. There's the E and the F happening together. So that's why frequently with 13th chords we don't include the 11th. We get this sound instead. There we go. All right. However, if a composer does want that 11th note included in their chord, for some reason, sometimes we want that effect. If you want this chord, then they'll include it in their chord symbol, meaning we would see something like this, C1311. Okay. All right. Now, when will we see all this 9th, 11th, 13th business? Do we see any of these on any chord? Well, not usually. Let's look at the different types of chords. Major types of chords, C major type of chord, you could see 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths. Usually the 11th will be altered, but we'll discuss that later. But on C major chords, you could see chords as high as a 13. Dominant chords, we can also see chords as high as a 13. Minor chords, occasionally 13 is not too frequent. For practical purposes, the highest alteration, or the highest 9th, 11th, or 13th that we see on those chords is the 11th. And actually on half diminished chords and fully diminished chords, 11th would be the highest, where frequently 9th would be the highest, but sure, every once in a great while you might see these chords going up as high as the 11th. So we're not going to have to be worried too much about building half diminished 13th chords and fully diminished 13th chords. We're not going to see them too much. Sometimes you might see them in a big band chart or a vocal arrangement, in which case you've got to learn how to do it. But if you're reading a lead sheet, very infrequently would you ever see anything beyond anything that we're seeing here. All right, so now let's go on to other things, how you can alter these 9th, 11th, and 13th chords. Different types of chords. Okay, so let's see. We've got 5 basic types of 7th chords we're dealing with. We've got the major 7s. We've got dominant 7s. We've got minor 7s. We've got half diminished. And we've got fully diminished. Now remember, we can see 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths on these 3, occasionally a 13th on this one, and 11ths on these, but we can also start to alter these pitches. We can have a lowered 9th, or a raised 9th, or a raised 11th. So let's look at when we would see those. Well, on major 7ths, we'll see 9s, but I don't know that I've ever seen any kind of alteration to a 9th on a major 7th chord. By alteration, I mean that we could take that 9th, let's say in the case of C, in which we go up to D, we could alter that to become a raised 9 or a sharp 9, like a D sharp, or a lowered 9th, like a D flat. So rarely, if ever, would you ever see an alteration to the 9th on a major chord. However, the 11th is most frequently, if it's going to be offered at all, is going to be raised. And we could see a 13th, but it won't get any alteration at all. Let's go ahead and look real quickly at what all these alterations mean. So remember, here's our C major scale. The ninth is here with a D. When we say a raised or a sharp 9, we're saying that that D could be a D, or it could be a flatted 9, which would be a D flat, or it could be a raised 9, which is a D sharp. We could have those three alterations. Let's go down here and build the 11ths. Now, 11th is F. We could see an 11th, but we would never see a flat 11. And if you think about why we'd never see a flat 11th, if you think about the fourth scale degree being F, in the case of C, if we were to lower that, it would be an F flat, and that would be the same thing as our E. So you'll never see a flat 11th. However, you could see a raised 11th. And for 13ths, we could see a 13th, which would be A, and you could see a lowered 13th, which would be A flat. But we'll never see a raised 13. A raised 13 would be the same thing as the dominant 7, so we'll never see these. So here's our list of all the alterations we possibly have. We could see 9s, flat 9s, and sharp 9s. We could see, whoops, I'm sorry about that, 9s, flat 9s, and sharp 9s. We could see 11s and sharp 11s. And we could see flat 13s and 13s, but no raised 13s and no flat 11s. So now let's go back to seeing when we're going to see these alterations. On major 7th chords, we're not going to see alterations to the 9th or the 13th, but we could see an alteration to the 11th, and rarely, if ever, would you ever see a plain 11th on a major 7th chord. That note wants to go up to be a raised 11th. Now, let's go to some of these other ones. Minor 7th. I'm going to skip over dominant for a minute. Minor 7ths, you'll see 9s, but no alterations to that 9th. Very rarely, if ever. We could see 11ths, but no alterations to the 11th. At least in sort of your functional, common place jazz that everybody plays. If you get to more free styles of jazz or more avant-garde styles of jazz or more atonal styles of jazz, you might start to see some of these. But in functional kinds of jazz that bebop players play and post-bop players and hard bop players and swing players play, you'll never see these other kinds of alterations. 13s, sure, every once in a great while, but not too frequently, and no alteration to it. And with these final two half diminished, we could see 9s and we could see 11s, but no alterations to those. So far you can see that only one alteration we've got to be aware of, and that's an alteration to the 11th on a major chord. But let's look at dominant, and this is where all the interesting stuff happens. Dominant chords, you can pretty much do anything. We could see a regular 9th on a dominant chord, C9. We could see a lowered 9th, and we could see a raised 9th. So in other words, we might see a C9, a C7 with a flat 9, or a C7 with a sharp 9. With 11ths, generally, if we're going to go up as far as an 11th, it's going to be raised. Every once in a great while, I'm going to put an asterisk here, meaning that this is an every once in a while type of thing, a regular 11th. Here's a C9 with a sharp 11, C, E, G, B flat, D, and F sharp. Here's a C9 or a C11. C11. You can hear the dissonance happening there, which is between that E and that F, which is kind of undesirable. However, a lot of jazz composers will write C11 and they'll just assume that you're going to take the third out of there. So C11s do happen sometimes. For 13th chords, we could see the regular 13th and we could see a lowered 13th, both. So here's that C13. Remember, we don't put the 11th in unless it's included. And here's a C flat 13, C, E, G, B flat, D, and A flat. Also, we could see combinations of these alterations happening together. We could see a chord like a C7 flat 9, sharp 11, 13, or a G7 sharp 9, sharp 11, flat 13. We could see all kinds of different chords like that. All the real interesting sort of chromatically embellished, colorful stuff in terms of 9th, 11th, and 13th, generally most of it happens on dominant chords. So when you hear those big fancy jazz chords, quite frequently they're dominant type chords. There's a dominant 7 with a sharp, a flat 9 and a sharp 11 and a 13. There's a G7 with a sharp 9 and a sharp 5. Here's a B. Sometimes it's just called an alt chord. There's another B7 with a sharp 5 and a sharp 9. We can do almost anything we want. One thing that doesn't happen too much is if you're going to have an unaltered tone, if you're going to have a regular 9th, you wouldn't include the alteration to the 9th with it. So we would very rarely ever see a C7 with a 9th and a flat 9. Sounds kind of dissonant. We wouldn't see that too much. You could occasionally see both alterations to the 9th in there. C7 with a flat 9 and a sharp 9 both. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at building some of these. Now that we know where we will see these alterations and where we won't. Okay, so let's start out by building, how about something from B flat? Let's build a B flat major, B flat major 9 sharp 11. Now, the sharp does not necessarily mean that you are going to put a sharp there. What it means is you're raising that 11th a half step from what's in the major scale. So let's build our B flat major 7th part first. 1, 3, 5, 7 of the major scale, B flat, D, F, and A. Okay. Now we're going to go up to the 9th, which is the second note of the B flat major scale. That's C. And then we're going to go to the 11th. Well, the 11th or 4th note of the B flat major scale would be an E flat. So by raising that E flat by a half step, we're actually making it an E natural. And there's your B flat major 9 sharp 11. Let's build one from, how about from D? This one where I'm going to build a D13 flat 9. D13 flat 9. Oh, by the way, here's the sound of this B major 9th chord sharp 11. There we go. Nice sound. Okay, here, the D13 flat 9. Okay, well, what kind of a chord is it? Well, it's letter followed by number with no big M's or small M's or circles or anything like that, so it's a dominant chord. So the first thing you want to do is build a D dominant 7th chord. D, F sharp, A, and C. Now you just do what it says. Well, we want to have a flat 9. The second note of the D major scale is an E. So it's going to be some kind of an E, and it says to flat that, so we're going to make that an E flat. Then it says 13. Now remember, in the case of 13th, you don't include the 11th unless it's asked for. So we're going to go straight up to the 13th. 13th is the equivalent of 6. So what's the 6th note of the D major scale? The 6th note of the major scale is B. So we're going to put a B up there. And then it just says to leave it alone, so we don't have to do anything with it. So here's your D13 flat 9. That's a nice sound too. Okay. How about building one more? Let's go for a, how about a C sharp minor 11th? No alterations in this one. Okay. So what kind of a chord is it? It's a minor 7th, so we're going to do that first. C sharp, E, G sharp, and B. There's your minor 7th chord. Okay. Now it says to build an 11th. Well, the 11th assumes that the 9th and the 11th are both in there. So the 9th note of the C sharp major scale. Oh, that's not easy. How many sharps are in C sharp? Well, there's 7, so you could look at it that way. But another way to do it, a little bit easier. Well, I don't know that C sharp major scale, but I know C. And the 9th and 11th note of the C major scale are D and F. So I know it has to be a D and F. Now, can you just imagine that if we have a C sharp major scale, if the C major scale, the 9 and 11 is D and F, then we're going to raise both of those pitches to make it the 9 and 11 of a C sharp major scale. So really, our 9th and 11th are D sharp and F sharp to make a C sharp minor 11. Again, another nice sound. Now, one more thing about the correct spelling of these chords down here. Let's say I had this chord symbol. E, let's get this right, E flat 9. E flat 9. Now, what is this chord? Is this an E flat 9, or is it an E flat 9? In other words, is it a dominant ninth chord built on E flat, or is it a dominant chord built on E with a flat 9? Well, the answer to this is, this chord, if I were to see this, this is an E flat 9. So how would I distinguish the difference between an E flat 9 and an E flat 9? Well, the idea is the highest unaltered chord tone needs to be in your chord symbol. The highest unaltered chord tone needs to be in your chord symbol. So if I were to build this chord, I'd build it as an E flat dominant ninth chord. E flat, G, B flat, and D flat. There's my E flat 7. And then I put the second note of the E flat major scale on top. That would be an F. If I want this chord, which is an an E dominant chord with a flat 9, right? F natural would be the flat 9. I have to include the highest unaltered chord tone in my chord symbol, which means I need to call this an E7, and then after that I can put flat 9. For extra clarity, you can put that flat 9 in a parentheses. That helps people to know that this is a separate thing over there. So E7 flat 9, highest unaltered chord tone in your chord symbol. The other thing to know about is that the symbols sharp and plus are synonymous, and the symbols flat and minus are synonymous, meaning that I could have E7 flat 9, or I could have E7 minus 9. I could have E7 plus 9 or E7 sharp 9. Just remember that the accidentals, sharp or flat, don't mean necessarily to put that accidental next to the pitch. They just mean to raise or lower that pitch with respect to its major scale. Let's try some more chords like this. Now, here's a chord, and we're going to try to figure out what the chord symbol for it would be. Okay, there's a chord. So what is this? Well, the first thing you need to do is figure out the root. Okay, the root of this chord obviously is D. One of the good things about 9s, 11s, and 13s is rarely do they appear in inversions. So the lowest note you're going to see typically is the root of the chord. So this is some kind of D chord. The next thing you need to do is figure out what kind of a seventh is it. It could be major, minor, dominant, half diminished, fully diminished, or it could even be something else. So we look at these lowest four pitches, D, F sharp, A, and C, and that clearly is a dominant seventh. So this is going to be a D with some letters followed after it. But if it's a D9, we're going to write D9. If it's a D13, we're going to write D13. If it's a D11, so I'm not going to write 7 yet until I know more about the other pitches. Now the next note I've got up is an E flat. Okay, well, that's obviously the ninth because we're working our way up the spaces here. But what kind of a ninth is it? Regular, flat, sharp? We're not sure. So that E flat, well, the second note of the D major scale is E. So by flattening that, we've made this a flat 9. So that's a flat 9. And what about that B up there? Well, let's see. 9, 11, 13. That's some kind of 13. Now, it could either be a regular 13 or a flat 13. Well, the sixth note of the D major scale is B natural. So you can see this is going to be a flat 13. Now, remember our rule was you need to have the highest unaltered chord tone in your chord symbol. And it looks like the highest unaltered chord tone we have here is the 7th. So we're going to call this a D7. And then over here in parentheses, we could put flat 13 and flat 9. We could also put minus 13 and minus 9 if we want. D7, flat 9, flat 13. Let's try building another one. About building this one from A right. Looks like we got A, C sharp, E, G, B sharp, D sharp, and F sharp. That's a big chord. Let's see. Ooh, that's a nice one. Okay, there it is again. All right, so let's figure out what this is. First thing, the root of the chord is A. Okay, what type of a seventh chord do we have on the bottom? A, C sharp, E, and G. Okay, that's a dominant seventh. So it's a letter followed by a number. Now we need to go and find out what kinds of 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths we have. B. Well, the second note of the A major scale is B, but this is a B sharp, so that's a sharp 9. Okay, D. Okay, the fourth note or 11th note of the A major scale is D natural, and this is a D sharp, so it looks like we've got a sharp 11 here. And F sharp, looks like it's going to be a sharp 13. Wait a minute, we can't have a sharp 13. It can either be a 13 or a flat 13. Well, let's think about that. The 13th or 6th note of the A major scale is F sharp, so it looks like we've got a regular 13th here. So we've got a dominant chord with a raised 11, a raised 9, and a 13. So remember, you need to have the highest unaltered chord tone in your chord symbol. So the highest unaltered chord tone we have here is the 13th. So we're going to write A13, and then over here in parentheses, we're going to show that there's an alteration to the 11th and the 9th. Now we can do that with a sharp or a plus. So I'm going to do pluses this time. A13 plus 11 plus 9, and there's your chord symbol for this chord. There's more information in the packet about voicings. Now, when a pianist or an arranger or a guitarist sees these chord symbols, they don't necessarily play all the pitches. What they do is voice them. Quite frequently, a guitarist or a pianist will eliminate the root of the chord because that would be functioning down there in the bass roll. They also might eliminate other pitches that aren't so important, especially if the chord is very big, like the fifth of the chord. Quite frequently, you can get a big sound like this with just only four notes by eliminating some of the less important notes down at the bottom part structure of the chord. So we're not going to talk today about voicings, A and B voicings. Just know that with arrangers and pianists and guitarists, they don't necessarily play all of these pitches. They voice the chord. So sometimes you might see an unusual looking chord and wonder what it is, and it turns out to be a voicing of one of these 9th, 11th, or 13th chords. So that does it for 9th, 11th, and 13th. We're also going to talk in this unit about third part of modes, and we're also going to talk about the bebop scale. So I hope you enjoy those.